This meeting is called to order, and we will begin with a moment for prayer or reflection. Thank you. Are there any points of privilege? Councillor Sharps?
Thank you so much. I apologize because I just put it on my computer to read properly. So I would like to use this opportunity to congratulate a young man locally. 32-year-old Medicine Hat man won his 6th National North American One-Armed Golfing Association Championship in Shelton, Washington. This marks Jesse Florkowski's 7th title in 8 years. And for those of you that have never seen him play, it's amazing. He won the title in an unassisted division of the tournament. The other division allows for golfers to use prosthetics to assist them in their game. The tournament started Monday with the first 2 qualifying rounds. Florkowski shot a 1 over par 73 in the first round and followed that up with a 4 under par 68 on Tuesday. He's off to Pinehurst to compete in the Adaptive Open held by the United States Golf Association on July 18th in Pinehurst, North Carolina. Pinehurst has hosted a number of prestigious golf tournaments, including 3 U.S. Open championships, 1 U.S. Women's Open, 3 U.S. Amateur championships, and 1 PGA championship and the Ryder Cup. We are very proud of Jesse, and we wish him all the best in the upcoming championship.
Thank you, Councillor Sharps. Councillor Robbins?
Thank you. And through the chair, I noticed that on the agenda tonight are the minutes of our public services meeting where we talked about our Truth and Reconciliation Committee recommendations that are here for adoption tonight. And I thought that we should read the land acknowledgement of the city in this circumstance and on this important day to acknowledge a number of things, including the work done by the committee. So I'll just start by acknowledging that Medicine Hat is situated on Treaty 7 and neighbor to Treaty 4 territory. We are on the traditional lands of the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Stoney Nakoda, Tsuut'ina, as well as the Cree, Sioux, and the Saulteaux bands of the Ojibwe peoples. We are also within the homelands of the Métis Nation within Region 3. The City of Medicine Hat acknowledges that we live and work on treaty territory. The city pays respects to all Indigenous peoples and honors their past, present, and future. We recognize and respect their cultural heritages and relationships to the land. Thank you, Mayor Clark.
Thank you. Moving on to the adoption of the agenda. I would like to move item number 9.4.1 to be dealt with after item 7.1. Are there any other additions to the agenda? City Clerk?
Thank you, Mayor Clark. I'd like to add under new business, item 14.1, new project, Clear Horizon, and 14.2, amendment to indemnification policy.
Thank you. All right, seeing no further additions, that we will adopt the agenda. Moving on to item 6, adoption of the minutes. 6.1, Medicine Hat regular City Council meeting of June 20th, 2022. Are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, the minutes are accepted. All right, now we have a presentation. The presentation is Key Budget Assumptions, and it's being presented of 2023-2024, and it's being presented by Lola Barta, Director of Finance. And it is related to item 9.4.1, which we've moved up to be dealt with right after this item. So, Ms. Bartle, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, Your Worship and members of council. All right. The purpose of this presentation is to request council direction on the key budget assumptions for 2023 and 2024, request council approval for the one-time transfer on July 5th of $50 million to the Heritage Savings Reserve, and to provide council with information on a pathway to achieve, fund, and offset sustainable budget gap, as well for council to consider and approve other fees and Heritage Savings Reserve endowment elements at a later date. So just to be clear, this is not a request to approve the budget. The complete budget will be coming forward and presented to council for approval in December of this year. So just some information on our current situation. The municipal operations are spending more than we are collecting from property taxes and fees, which creates a budget gap. In 2022, the budget gap is $9 million. We have approximately $130 million in municipal expenditures, of which $9 million is being funded through the Tax Rate Stabilization Reserve. So at the end of 2022, we have $16.5 million in our Tax Rate Stabilization Reserve. If this $9 million gap continues, the Tax Rate Stabilization Reserve will be depleted in less than 2 years without further action. We are currently in a healthy financial position, and we do want to ensure that we continue this way. There are additional pressures and challenges that have been identified over the next few years, which are expected to increase this budget gap. We know from past experience that it is risky to rely on the volatile commodity revenues to fund our municipal operations. And so we are looking to implement a plan that includes a stable revenue stream. We want to continue to be good financial stewards, and therefore we must plan for a sustainable future, as well as to plan for unexpected future events. So we continue to have challenges in 2023 and beyond. These are identified as the current economic conditions. So we've seen inflation fluctuate over the last few months here. In May, inflation was 7.1% in Alberta. The market has also been fluctuating. Our investment returns are decreasing, and our borrowing rates are increasing. As well, commodity prices continue to fluctuate. We've seen reduced Government of Alberta contributions previously, as well as they are expected to continue into the future. And we do continue to have cost pressures. So our 2021 cost reductions are not fully sustainable without corresponding service adjustments. In some areas, we did cut too deep, and we are struggling to meet current service levels. So in our 2023 to 2024 budget, we will require adjustments to sustain the current service levels. Our property taxes were held flat in 2020 and 2021. This resulted in a $7.5 million revenue reduction from our original plan. As I mentioned, our municipal budget gap in 2022 was $9 million. This has not been solved yet and is expected to continue into the future. I also want to note that Council's strategic plan has not been included in any of the information yet. Departments are currently working on their budgets and will be incorporating these items in their budgets over the next few months. This slide really focuses on our electric generation business unit. So I do want to focus on the graph on the right here. This graph shows the commodity prices are volatile and that the high prices are not expected to continue. You'll note that in 2021 and 2022, we are showing a surplus. This surplus is related to the post-pandemic recovery and coal generation facility shutdowns, which increased the market prices. Electric generation was able to export excess production onto the grid and achieved higher revenues due to the higher market commodity prices. You will also note on this graph that our future outlook is looking like our surpluses are declining. And so the reason for the future surpluses, the decline in the future surpluses, is primarily related to the increase in federal carbon costs, as well as construction of renewables and cogeneration facilities. This is driving the prices down. So we do know from past experience that it can be risky to rely on this volatile commodity revenue. And so our objective is to look for a more stable revenue stream to fund our municipal operations. And so how do these challenges impact our 2023 to 2024 outlook? Well, as I mentioned, our 2022 budget gap is not yet solved. So we're starting off with a $9 million gap. Layering in our cost pressures, our external and internal cost pressures, that will increase that budget gap to $19 million in 2023 and $20 million in 2024. If we were to just increase our property tax revenue and user fees by 4%, that would reduce the gap. However, as you can see, that results in 14.7 in 2023 and 15.5 in 2024. So this gap is continuing to grow. 30.3 million of funding is required over the next 2 years. As I mentioned previously, this budget gap is currently funded through our tax rate stabilization reserve. The draw on this reserve from 2022 to 2024 is 39.3 million. And the graph at the bottom here, the chart at the bottom, shows that this reserve will be depleted by 2024. So as I mentioned, the surpluses from our energy division are not expected to continue into the future. We do need to be mindful of how our cash is allocated. So if we're putting all of our cash into this tax rate stabilization reserve to fund our operations, how will we pay for some of our capital requirements into the future? We need to ensure that we have sufficient funds for our operations, our capital, and our long-term obligations. As well, we also need to plan for future unexpected events. And so to continue to be in good financial shape, we need to look at a reliable funding source. So before we talk about our plan forward, I would like to just talk a little bit about how our property taxes align with inflation and the reduction in our government funding. So this graph has a few different things going on here. The green line represents our actual tax revenue over the last few years, or 5 years. The black line is the increase in the inflation and the government funding reduction, and the blue line is just the difference between the green line and the black line. And so, as you can see through this graph, the average tax revenue increase over 5 years is 2.86%. The average inflation increase was 2.91. So our tax revenue is currently aligned with inflation. Just a few other items to note here. Property taxes were increased in 2018 and 2019 as part of our financially fit strategy. This decision was made to narrow the budget gap. In 2020 and 2021, taxes were held flat to provide support to residents during COVID. And in 2022, Council approved a 3.1% tax revenue increase. So we want to ensure that we continue to align with inflation. Otherwise, our revenues will not be sufficient to cover our existing costs.
Director Barta,
Yes.
can you explain the blue line a little bit more? There appears to be a difference between the increase and the tax increase and inflation, but also government funding. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, the blue line is representing what happened with our tax revenue as compared to inflation and government funding. So in 2018, you can see that the difference there is about 2%. And then as we move forward, you can see that that blue line is increasing as we move forward. And that is mainly because of the increase in our tax revenue as we responded to the Financially Fit initiative. And then as we held property tax revenue flat, you can see that blue line is decreasing because our actual tax rates have actually decreased below the inflation amount. And then you can see in 2021 and 2022, they are brought back in line.
Thank you. So how does provincial government funding play into that?
Yeah, so the provincial government funding is the reduction in our grants, so, and as well in our fine revenue. So provincial government reduced the amount that we were getting for fines, as well our grant in place of taxes. They cut back on what they were providing municipalities. And so that reduction puts extra pressure on providing additional revenues through property taxes or other sources now because we've lost that funding.
So when you look at the inflation average, how would you calculate into that the government funding? So that would create a greater gap between the black line, is it a black line? Black line and the green line.
Yeah, so how we calculated that was we've got inflation in there, which hasn't really been increasing a lot except for just lately. And then we layered on the reduction of the government funding. So what did our property taxes need to increase by in order to cover that gap?
So is it the case that the blue line actually has one more variable in it than the difference between the black line and the green line?
No, it is just taking that difference. So whatever that black line includes inflation as well as the reduction in government funding.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so our pathway forward. It is important that we continue with a planned approach to address the budget gap. This isn't something new that we've been doing this for a number of years. Over the years, we've implemented Financially Fit. We've also implemented Accelerated Financially Fit. And so we continue to look at all options available to balance the budget. So moving forward, how do we narrow the budget gap and the reliance on the tax rate stabilization reserve? We may never get to a zero budget gap, but is there an amount that could be funded through a reliable revenue stream? Our current indications say that a $7 million budget gap could be manageable, but it does require planning to get there. So one approach is through revenue increases. At a minimum, revenue increases must match inflation. Our revenues need to keep pace with services. So if the cost of our services are increasing, then we also should increase our revenues accordingly. Our focus really should be to live within our means and plan for our future needs. As well, we will continue to look for ongoing economic growth opportunities to increase the tax base and the revenues. Part of this plan also requires creating a stable revenue stream, and one way that could be done is through a reliable endowment fund. This would require an increase to the Heritage Savings Reserve Fund. If the Heritage Savings Reserve Fund is increased, we could start receiving an endowment as early as 2025. This would provide a stable revenue stream, and it would reduce the reliance on the tax rate stabilization reserve. I do want to note that within our current Heritage Savings Reserve bylaw, funds that are transferred into this reserve are locked in, which means they are not available for another use. However, it doesn't restrict council. Council does have the ability to amend the bylaw going forward. And lastly, we will also continue to look for sustainable cost reduction opportunities.
Director Barta, well, you're saying that council always could amend the bylaw going forward. The idea behind the Heritage Savings Reserve is that it would be a long-term fund, and so yes, we could change it, but the purpose is to create a principal amount so that we can take the interest and fund operations. Is that right?
Yes, that's
Okay,
correct.
thank you.
Although council has the opportunity to do that, it's not recommended. Okay, so we've provided a few scenarios to consider. The first scenario really looks at a significant increase in revenues in the early years. And the purpose of this is really to start narrowing that budget gap as soon as we can. So in this scenario, property tax and user fees are increased by 6% in 2023 and 5% in 2024. We would also recommend that other fees are increased by $2 million in 2023 and $1 million in 2024. You can see from my previous chart of where I was showing the gap of 15 million, this does reduce the gap significantly, 10.6, and then by 2026, you're at 7.8 million. So this would achieve that target sustainable budget gap of 7 million by 2028, and it would start reducing the reliance on the reserves by 2027. Scenario 2 looks at increasing revenues to align with inflation. So because of the high level of inflation over the past few months, we are expecting inflation to be around 4%. So property taxes and user fees would be increased by 4% across the 4-year period. We would also look to increase other fees by 2 million and 1 million. So you can see in this scenario, the budget gap is reduced, but not as much as scenario 1. Scenario 3 is really taking scenario 2, but also layering in an endowment. So you can see in scenario 3, in 2025, if our Heritage Savings Reserve is increased, that could provide a $5 million endowment starting in 2025 and continuing on. So that would reduce our budget gap, or the funding that we would require from the Tax Rate Stabilization Reserve, to $7 million in 2025.
Director Barta, so you have user fees. What would that include?
User fees would be fees utilizing our facilities, our amenities, those types of things.
So would you be looking at a 4% across the board, or how would you plan on addressing the 4%?
Yeah, it may not be realistic to do a flat 4% across the board, but we would look at what the market could bear and how we could adjust that. The expectation is that overall, the user fees would increase by 4%.
Thank you.
Okay, so our recommendation to council is scenario 3. Tonight, as I mentioned, we are looking for alignment on the key budget assumptions. That would include a 4% tax and user fee increase. We are also requesting approval on a transfer as of July 5th of $50 million to the Heritage Savings Reserve. We are providing information to council on a pathway to achieve, fund, and offset a sustainable budget gap, and this will come forward at a later date for council to approve. If we are looking to draw an endowment as early as 2025, we would require at least $75 million into our Heritage Savings Reserve to build that reserve up in order to draw a 5 million endowment fund. So we would come back to council to request an additional 25 million on January 1st, 2023. And we would also come back to council to look at an increase in other fees, and that could be as early as the fall of 2022. So again, this is not a request to approve the budget. We are looking for direction and approval on the 50 million transfer to the Heritage Savings Reserve. We will be coming back at a later date for the full budget approval for 2023 and 2024. And just to touch on a few next steps going forward here. If City Council approves the key operating budget assumptions, these will be incorporated into our 2023 and 2024 budget templates and guidelines. The departments are currently working on their capital projects and major operating expenses, and those will be submitted to our capital ranking committee here in the next few weeks. We will be providing a preliminary ranked project listing and capital funding envelope to council near the end of July. Departments are currently preparing their operating budgets, incorporating the approved key budget assumptions and any incremental adjustments or changes. So they're working on that now until August. And then we would come back to council to provide a draft of the business plans, the operating and the capital budgets in October. And then we would come back for final approval from council on the business plans, operating and capital budgets, including the utility rate bylaws, and that would happen in December of this year. And that concludes my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Can you go back to the slide, oops, the slide with the different scenarios on it? Oh, while we're waiting, interim city manager Feltham, do you have any additional comments?
Not at this time, Mayor Clark.
Thank you. So these, all of these scenarios outline a first year 4% or greater tax increase. Given that I think it's 2 years of zeros. So 2 questions. The 4% is tax revenue. So if inflationary pressures mean that property values go up, the actual mill rate would not necessarily go up.
Correct. Yes.
And is there an approach where we phase in tax increases at a slower rate and maybe push out the dependency on reserves to 2027 or 2028, just to make the first couple of years a little bit more manageable?
We could definitely provide a scenario for that. It does draw out our solution to narrow that budget gap. So the longer that we delay in increasing our property taxes, that will draw that out as well. We will be behind a little bit because we are expecting inflation. We are, in 2022, we're behind with inflation right now. And so we would need to catch up, bring our costs up to that level. So we are kind of starting behind already going into our 2023 budget. So that would just increase the budget gap and would take us a little bit longer to get there.
Interim city manager Feltham?
Thank you, Mayor Clark. Philosophically, when I look at 2 and 3, what it's trying to say is that on an inflation-adjusted basis, we're trying to be in a similar position to what we're in today. So, what an economist would say is we're attempting to remain in the same place in real terms. So we're saying there does need to be some adjustment if we're going to be able to continue to provide the services at the level that we are currently providing them, but which is something that we have heard strongly from our community. So with respect to your second question, I think that we could certainly come back to council with other alternatives that look at how it is that we pace change in a way that the council may want to see if this notion of staying consistent in real terms is not the direction council provides.
Thank you. I also just wanted to comment that I appreciate the idea of creating the endowment. I think that's a creative solution that minimizes the impact on residents and users, and I think that that's, definitely something that is a privilege of living in Medicine Hat, so. Oh, Councillor McGrogan.
Thank you. Through the chair, just thank you for the presentation, Director Barta. Could you just explain for everybody the difference between a reserve fund, our heritage fund, and the endowment fund that we're going to build? Where are they three separate pots of money, and what do they look like? That's my first question.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely do that. So we've separated our reserves into operating reserves, capital reserves, and the heritage savings reserve. Our operating reserves include our tax rate stabilization reserve, and the operating reserve is meant to fund our operation requirements. And so we do have a policy in place where we have a target balance in each of those reserves in order to meet those ongoing obligations. The capital reserve is built up and mainly used for capital requirements going forward, as well as our asset retirement obligation. And so we want to make sure that we do have sufficient funding in that reserve in order to meet those future requirements to help continue to build our capital, maintain our capital, as well as meet our future obligations. And the Heritage Savings Reserve is a reserve that has been established and is meant to provide an endowment to the residents of Medicine Hat. And so that reserve is a separate reserve on its own. And the idea behind that reserve is that any of the principal that goes into that reserve would not be spent or touched, but we could take any investment earnings out of that reserve to help. And that could be utilized for anything, either for operations or for any other items required.
Thank you. So then that's where the endowment will come from.
Correct.
So you got that straight.
Yes.
So, and I know these are just assumptions, but again, so if we know that our investments are kind of dropping and inflation's going up, how much of a variable could that be on our assumptions? Like, I know you can't get to worst case scenarios, and I know we don't have a crystal ball, but let's say our investments drop by, 3% more. Where does that put us in the position on scenario 3 where we're drawing from our reserves, that $5 million? Could you give me just an idea of what that might look like if the scenarios changed drastically in some way? And thank you.
Yeah, and you are correct. It is dependent on our investment earnings. As you are aware, though, we have put a strategic allocation investment portfolio in place. And so we are trying to protect ourselves from the market fluctuations as best we can. That being said, there is always risk of, the markets taking a downturn and being affected or impacted by that. Within this scenario, our current forecast is to have a 5% increase or a 5% return on our investments. And how we came with the $5 million is we took a very conservative approach and said, if we only were to receive 3% on our investment returns, would that be manageable, and could we continue to receive that endowment? And so that's the calculation that we put in place. So we took a very conservative approach to do this. But again, if the markets do take a significant downturn, this could be impacted. And again, we would have to find alternative funding options for that.
Thank you. Can I just, one more? Through the chair, thank you. So then finally, I guess, so now we kind of say, yeah, these assumptions are pretty good. You know, we're going to go with number 3 and move forward. Now we go back to the departments and say, okay, council said it's 4% across the board, whatever it might be. Tell me how those departments, when they make those decisions, I kind of know this, but I would like to hear it, I guess, for everybody's sake. We've went through a bunch of, as you mentioned, financially fit, accelerated, financially fit. There's been a lot of work done. We know we have some shortcomings. I take it, do we already know kind of what some of those shortcomings are going to be and where we need to shore things up? And, or are you depending now on the departments individually to come back and say, hey, listen, we can't do X without Z? Or how does that look, process-wise?
Yeah, so the departments will use these guidelines or these assumptions as a guideline, and they'll go away, create their budgets. You know, in every year, we're always expecting that departments are being very conservative when creating their budgets and only putting in place what is required to meet the current service level and get the work done. And so there will be adjustments made to the budgets. They will put in what they require to keep those levels, the service levels, at what we're currently providing. But there is also the opportunity to do a review at the executive level and take a look and say, okay, how is this impacting, and what are our priorities, and do our priorities shift depending on, if the increase comes in higher than a 4%, what can we do to offset that? And we would look at all opportunities in that case.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Hyder?
Thank you, through the chair. Thank you, Director Barta, for your presentation. Just a question. I just wanted maybe everyone to kind of understand when we talk about reduction from the government. Do you have an idea of what the reduction would be? I'm sure.
Yeah, I do. Just have to find the page. Sorry. Okay, so our grants in place of taxes, we had a 25% reduction in 2020, and they are reducing that to 50% going forward. So that's approximately a $500,000 reduction. Our fine revenue was also reduced, and that impacted our operations, our revenue stream by about $550,000. And then we had some smaller grant funding that came to just over $100,000. So we're looking at, just over $1 million per year moving forward in government grant reductions that are impacting our operations. Yeah. There are other reductions in grants that will be impacting our capital as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just as a follow-up to that, can you explain the capital reductions as well?
Yeah, so those capital reductions are really related to our Municipal Sustainability Initiative, the MSI. That program is being replaced by the local government fiscal framework. And so we are expecting approximately 25% grant reduction from our historical MSI funding. So I think that's approximately 11 million that will be reduced for our capital plans.
So total of 12 million approximately going forward, reduction from the provincial government?
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Van Dyke.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you, and through the chair. So when we're talking about an increase of 4% in fees, My concern always is impact on low-income residents in our community. And we currently do have the fair entry program for recreational facilities and are piloting a fair entry program with transit. And I'm wondering if you have factored in expanded access to that fair entry program into these numbers, or if they're so negligible that it wouldn't make any difference in the overall budget.
Yeah, those amounts are quite small. I believe currently it's about $6,000 per year, so quite small in the whole scheme of things. We could look at this further to make sure that it is being effective going forward. So that is something that we could look at as part of our new budget plan in 2023 and 2024.
If I could follow up on that, I think that would be fantastic. I would like to, I know I've talked about this before, have it costed out if we expanded that across all city services and fees. Thanks.
Councillor Hirsch?
Thanks, Your Worship. I think it's just important for I guess, the general public and everyone to understand what's the thinking behind trying to address our shortfall in our budget, for one. But yet, I hear cries all the time, about the Heritage Trust Fund, and, we're putting money away, but, it's raining cats and dogs out here. Life's pretty tough. There's challenges all around. So one of the things that what I was trying to champion all the time is taking care of the present, and I mean by the, I'll call them the shareholders, because everyone's got a vested interest in the Medicine Incorporated. So the driver of our revenue being oil and gas and the utilities, et cetera. So my thought process was always, how do we benefit, and the Medicine Hat advantage is a well-used term, so I'll stay away from that. But how do we provide benefit to the here and now? And then how do we provide benefit to our future stakeholders, our shareholders in the future? So what I like about what's being offered is that it is a nod to our existing shareholders, that being the residents of Medicine Hat, from which we collectively own an entity that derives some profit. So the natural inclination is for it to derive some dividend / revenue to the residents. So I think that's encapsulated. I appreciate the stress test that you did on the ability on the endowment to see if it can withstand a downturn. Quite frankly, we as council, you as administration can come back in that unforeseen time that we run into a problem. And I sat on a committee locally that does endowment funds, and there was a year we couldn't even give out any endowments because of the crash. So what I'm saying is I think it makes sense right now what you're offering, because it does take care of the future and the present as far as Hatters go. One thing that people need to understand is that we changed the dividend policy to reflect the capital requirements for every division first, because you have to take care of what your entity, take care of what you own. And then that allowed that to be taken care of, and then the net amount of that goes through the dividend policy, and correct me if I'm wrong, Director Barta, but then it goes to basically the Heritage Fund. So I like it in the fact that we're taking care of our operations first and foremost. Then whatever that flows through, we've got the luxury, quite frankly, as a city council to determine what makes sense from put it away or do we use it for current. So, and that, quite frankly, this endowment, for people to understand, is a legacy event that was driven by our oil and gas and utilities over the years. So I think that's important. But I think what is important when we talk about numbers, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it still, for every 1% we increase on taxes, gives us $800,000 worth of revenue? Is that pretty close to being same? So I think it's important when we talk about the provincial coffers or people that we used to get grants from, now cutting us by $12 million. Do that math. So 1% is $800,000. how do we recoup that sort of cut in a meaningful way without hurting our services, doing dire increases to taxes? So I think it's just very, very important that we kind of put all the cards on the table as counselors and the general public for them to understand the math and all this. And it is pretty simple. For every 1% is $800,000. And we've got some nuts to crack as far as deficit. It's difficult for us to determine a path forward, and I think it's the same thing we've talked about for the long time. We pull every type of lever we can. We're trying to find ways to increase revenue through revenue sources, both with economic development and that sort of thing, and certainly look at costs and savings that we can do from there. So I just want to assure and maybe reassure the Hatters that we're trying to take a very prudent approach here. So I really thank you and your team for making the options available to council. It sounds like we might maybe take another path, maybe not. But I think, you know, in due course, we're setting the stage for a discussion that I think is very important to Hatters and all of us in general. So thank you for that, and look forward to the work that lies ahead. So thanks.
Thank you.
Councillor Robbins?
Thank you, and through the chair, thank you, Director Barda. Just sitting here thinking, like, we sit here, unless you're Councillor Dubanowski, who's not here, while I say this, most of us sit here for a shorter length of time than he is, and we're just like this little cut of a very long history of a very fantastic city. So sitting here, I have to remember my contribution to the city is really a drop in a big bucket, and I do, but people ask me to sit here and express my opinion, so I shall. Or so I asked people if they would let me sit here, is actually the way it actually happened. So I like this idea of endowment very much. I think it honors our oil and gas and utilities history. I think it recognizes the stewardship that got us to this place, and it sort of eliminates that risk of the commodity market. So I like that very much. I like the idea that some advantage we have now is maintained for future generations, even as things change in those markets. So I appreciate all of the hard work done to, and the stewardship in the past to make sure we had those funds available to us to even be able to make this decision is a privilege, to be honest with you. So that's the good news. The bad news is inflation is hitting everybody tremendously. And so when I see I don't know if you ever watch House Hunters, they always have three options, they with one, so I'm like Xing out option number one. Those numbers are really high. I understand why they're there, but it's not the place I want to live. So when we're talking about endowment and 4%, I think, and then the fees, that sort of transfers costs onto residents who are also suffering the same issues of inflation that we are. And so I have some big concerns about that. My preference, which I didn't see as an option available to me, is to look at some decreased service levels. And I think, you know, it's like Councillor Hirsch said, pulling different levers to figure out how that meets the balance. You know, if we decrease service levels by 2% and increase by 2%, what does that look like? What does that mean? So, I mean, I recognize that you're here in the big picture trying to figure out where this council wants to go, and I'm probably not helping, and I apologize. I completely agree with the endowment and the amounts proposed, for sure. I just think inflation is hurting everybody a lot. And I think that if it means that we have to balance that out by reducing some service levels, that's something that should be pursued. So my thoughts for what's they're worth. But thank you again for your time and effort putting this together for us.
So I will note that this is just the presentation, and so we have to receive that. We will hopefully get a motion to receive that for information, and then we will be dealing with the actual recommendations in item 9.4.1, which we've moved up. So, Councillor Hirsch?
So I'll move reception.
I'll second.
All right, so we will vote on receiving the presentation for information. And that's unanimous. Thank you very much, Director Barda. Stay close, maybe. All right, we're going to now move on to item 9.4.1, which is administrative committee meeting, or 9.4, I guess, administrative committee meeting, June 29th, 2022. And there's one item, it is key budget assumptions 2023 to 2024, and the item is for adoption.
So I'll move the item for adoption.
I'll second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Oops, pushed the wrong one. That's me. Okay, so I do like the idea of seeing some additional options. I definitely don't want to see service levels reduced, but I think how that plays out is very much in the details. I think that it's a possibility that we don't necessarily, just in looking at our suite of services, there may be services that, community is already providing, and we may be able to, leverage our amazing community to, work with us, partner with us to provide some of the services. I definitely know that we've cut services, and it may be the case that we need to increase services in some areas. But I think overall, just having that optionality is good, and I'm not sure if that maybe comes out later on in the process. So I know we have our business plans. So I guess my thinking is, it feels to me to be like tiny bit premature maybe to be looking at the 4% before we have like the business plans and we see, what items are in there, and looking at the prioritization of programs and capital expenditures. So perhaps interim city manager Feltham, you could just, I know Councillor McGrogan asked this question as well, it's sort of along the same line, but what the flow is. So if we're approving a 4%, like is right now we're directing staff to base their budgets on a 4% increase, but isn't it possible as they work through their business plans that they'll, potentially identify opportunities for spending decreases as well?
Mayor Clark, absolutely. So this is receiving general guidance from council as to budget assumptions. It is at the front end of the process. I think as we're working through, we will gather additional information. We will certainly share that with council, and but we will also go back and examine other potential structures that we will bring back to council as well. So this is very much the beginning of a discussion. I think it's very valuable that this be held in open council to see the nature of decisions that we have to make. But today isn't about reaching finality. Today is about having that broad sense as to the will of council.
Thank you. Councillor McGrogan?
Thank you. Through the chair, just in support of what the mayor had to say, and again, I want to be careful that we're not dipping into operations, but I think it's really important for us to kind of see where those cuts that were made already, how they've affected the organization and service levels through the process, and where and why they need to be restored, and maybe there's other opportunities where there could be some cuts. So I look forward to it. So I agree, at 4% does seem like a large amount, especially when we're dipping into our endowment in the future to even stay there. So, I think that really good look at our organization right through will be very much appreciated as we move through the process. Thank you.
Councillor Hirsch?
Well, Your Worship, I think one thing that needs to be just stated is that COVID is really threw a curveball at us, both society-based, of course, through the whole pandemic, but even financially. So it was the will of the council in the day to enact 2 successive years of 0% taxes. And you might say, you know, that's great. We needed it because of COVID. The reality is, it actually puts the city of Medicine Hat behind the 8 ball even further. So if you understand the idea of cumulative effect, so if we didn't even collect inflation during those years, we're actually deeper and deeper. So inevitably, and I'll be the first one to say, hey, I don't want to pay any more taxes, I'm exhausted. But the reality is the machine called the City of Medicine Hat has to operate. Services, everything that we want to expect in our city has to run. We are no different than any other agency, company, whatever that buys goods and services. We all know the increase to gas. We know that. But our city fleet runs on gas. And so that's a cost that we've taken on. So when we talk about doing our level best to save taxes and save expenses and look at every nook and cranny, I still am adamant that we need to pull on every lever. Just as an example in terms of options to this council, and one could be revenue increases, economic development, that's the revenue side. The expense side might be cuts to services, which I hate to say as well. But again, when we may be doing in a balanced manner, perhaps we can shed the pain as we go along, both to the taxpayer and the service, the fee for the service. The next time you pay for ice time as a hockey player, or the next time you go to the family leisure center is a fee, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we minimize that interruption and increase the best we can, and obviously doing it in a balanced way? So I'm hoping that's what we as council can receive as options moving forward. But the one parting thing I wanted to indicate to people is, for every year that we kind of delay the medicine means that we're taking money out of our, obviously, that could be destined to our heritage to fulfill the operational cost. So we're still spending the money, and it's either pay me now or pay me later. And just my argument is, I think in some ways we need to do it in a very respectful manner, but it still has to be an effort to get the activity on its way. So I'm looking forward to the feedback from administration's point of view in terms of different options, but really I don't want to leave any options off the table until we get to the point where we have to make those decisions. So hopefully that's the case. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would support the idea of using all the levers, including, you know, some of the options within the MGA that we may have not used in the past. And our finance team has shown the ability to come up with creative solutions, and I know they will continue to do that. And I don't think any one of us is, you know, advocating a decrease in services, but just to make sure that the suite of services is appropriate, that it's delivered efficiently. And obviously, those are things that are going to come out in the business plans. But, you know, as Councillor Hirsch pointed out, pay now or pay later. So we are where we are. So I would like to get some feedback on what we are approving here, because in the briefing note, it says that we're directing a 4% increase. We're approving a transfer to the endowment, which I haven't heard much negative feedback on the endowment. I think that's been very well received. And then there was one other thing in there too. Let me just take a boo. Receive for information the pathway to achieve, fund, and offset a sustainable budget gap. And this is for a one-year budget and a second year of forecast. So I don't know, is it, interim city manager Feltham, does my question make sense?
Absolutely. So first of all, we are approving the transfer to the Heritage Fund. The second thing is, I think we have received guidance and can start to advance the budgetary process. We will certainly use the input that we have here, so we will examine the impact of using the fours the way we are, but we will expand our scope to make sure that we are examining different ways to get to a financially sustainable place. And your third question was?
Yeah, I think just, that was it. What are we approving? And I think that you're saying that the direction is just generally the direction that we've given rather than the specific attachment.
Yep.
Just one final question. Do we have a sense of, or when will we have a sense of, what of the previous cuts are sustainable and how that's going to balance out moving forward?
Mayor Clark, that's something that I will be working with the administration on, is a broader assessment and understanding of where we are in our capacity to meet the obligations that we have to the people of Medicine Hat.
Much appreciated. Seeing no further questions or Acting City Clerk Robinson?
If I may, how I read the recommendation would be that we would be approving something in the attachment one. If the direction is different from council, is it possible to get a motion to amend that recommendation from somebody if it's different than the one that's currently on the floor?
A wise move. So I guess the amendment would be directs management to incorporate the key budget assumptions as discussed in council. Does anyone want to make that motion?
So I think the intent, before I do, I think the intention was to gather assumptions and general direction in terms of staff as a takeaway. One of the things that I heard around the council was to look at different options, and in general, a 4% with, and I think it was talked about having perhaps other increases. But I think what staff is looking for is an indicative direction. And what that means, and I'm prepared to make that amendment for staff to come back with different budget assumptions back to city council, including what was mentioned here. And I think we've properly verbalized it to staff in a manner that makes sense to them and they can go to work. So I am prepared to make the amendment. We're not necessarily providing direction on 1, 2, or 3. We're actually indicating them a general direction which way we want to go, if that makes sense. So however we need to have that worded, I am prepared to make that amending insofar as if it means that other options will be made at the time of budget, that I'm satisfied with, and we'll make that amendment.
Do you feel like is that clear?
Yes. Let me just talk operationally. So we've got amazing people that need to advance the process, and they're going to have to put some assumptions in place. And I think from what I heard from council, the most realistic assumption that we had is the one that was reflected. However, we heard that we should also be examining other things, and I think there was some really good discussion there. We have to start to do some of the math and to understand how this would work, but keeping in mind that we want to come back as well and say, as we looked at slightly different mixes to get us there, here's what the implications would be and how that would work. So I think we are going to have to start to move forward with getting some of the base mathematics done and the models started to develop out, but understanding that this is not fixed. This continues to be, guidance that we've received from council, but we want to be looking at alternatives at the same time and coming back and discussing those.
Councillor McGrogan?
Thank you. Through the chair, I'm just wondering, I don't want staff to kind of walk away going, oh man, it's kind of like our strat plan, when are we going to get it? So I'm just wondering, is there did we really kind of agree that number 3 is kind of a guideline with some alternate looks? Does that make more sense, I'm wondering, just to say, I think we kind of agreed that, we don't like, I think number 3 was the one that was recommended and it's damn close. But are we looking for some of those efficiencies and other ways through that process? Or just to throw it out there, I just want to keep it as simple as we can for staff's sake. And I don't know if there's any feedback from city manager in relation to that comment.
Councillor McGrogan, that's what I thought I said, but you said it far more articulately. That we do have that initial frame, but we need to be flexible, and having heard the comments from council, I think there are other things we will want to factor in as we're doing the analysis. But we do have to start with some numbers.
Councillor Sharps?
So I know we're kind of beating a dead horse here, but when I read the recommendation and the first point says that City Council directs management to incorporate the key budget assumptions, taxes, fees, and charges, and other management assumptions indicated, that to me is saying we're approving that increase. So can we do amendment to do the number 2 and number 3, which is the one-time transfer and the receipt of information to the pathway? But I'm confused as to why number 1 is in that, because we're not, like Managing Director or Director Barter said, we're not doing a budget increase right now. So to me, to tell you to incorporate it is actually approving a budget. Or am I missing something?
Councillor Sharps, this very much is council providing guidance. So this is that broad guidance that allows us to start to develop the budget, but from my perspective, nothing is formally being approved. So my apologies if the language doesn't reflect that.
Councillor Hirsch?
Well, and I just wanted to reiterate that this is just an indicating of budget assumptions. So in some cases, what staff is looking for is a narrowing of goalposts to some extent in some variance in terms of degrees, but certainly getting some indication of what this council might be looking at in the future. So does it state that this is where all of a sudden going to be increasing? Definitely not. What it does indicate is within the parameters and tightening up the goalposts a little bit so that staff has the ability to walk away going, okay, I think we have some, going back to the point, assumptions here. We have, record high inflation and there's some headwinds and that's the reality that we're in. So I don't construe this at all as being voting for or against any type of increases. What we're doing is looking at options and goalposts that eventually come back to us. Where the rubber does hit the road is when we're at budget time and we are actually looking at approval, so.
I don't disagree with Councillor Hirsch that is what the intention is. I think that the actual recommendation maybe is stated a bit more strongly than that. So back to the motion. I suppose that we could I would welcome a motion to amend item, or the briefing note recommendation number 1 to include a caveat that it is subject to the discussion held at the council meeting, open council meeting on July 4th.
I'll accept that.
Counselor Van Dyke?
I said I would second, sorry.
Sorry, I was just talking to myself.
And so now we will vote on that motion. All right, that is passed. So I would need another motion to adopt the agenda or the report as amended.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All right, we will vote. That's unanimous. All right. Now we will move back to item 8. So 8.1 is a public hearing regarding bylaw number 4667, a bylaw of the City of Medicine Hat to provide for partial exemptions from taxation under Part 10, Division 2 of the MGA pursuant to sections 346.1 and 364.1 and 364.2 of the MGA. City Clerk Robinson, were there any submissions received?
There were none.
All right, I will call the public hearing for bylaw 4667 to order. Is there any member of the public who wishes to speak for or against this bylaw? If so, please come down and state your name. For a second time, if there's anyone that would like to speak for or against this bylaw, please come down to the podium and state your name. For a third and final time, if there is any member of the public who would like to speak for or against this bylaw, please come down to the podium and state your name. So, seeing no members of the public who wish to speak, I now declare this public hearing closed.
I would like to move that bylaw 4667, a bylaw of the City of Medicine Hat to provide for partial exemptions from taxation under Part 10, Division 2 of the MGA pursuant to Section 364.1 and 364.2 of the MGA be read a second time.
It needs second.
Second.
Thank you. Are there any questions or debate?
I have an amendment, move that Section 2.3M subsection, M, I, and 2.3 subsection M, II of bylaw 4667 be amended by striking the number 615 and replacing it with 616.
Can I get a
Second.
Thank you. We will vote on the amendment. And that's unanimous. So now we will vote on the second reading as amended. And that's unanimous.
I would like to move that bylaw 4667 as amended be read a third time and passed.
Second.
Any questions or debate? Seeing none, we will vote on the third reading of the bylaw. And the bylaw is passed unanimously. Moving on to reports, under 9.1, Corporate Services Committee meeting of June 23rd, 2022. All items for information.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or debate? Seeing none, we will vote. And that's unanimous. Moving on to item 9.2, Public Services Committee meeting dated June 27th, 2022. There are 2 items for adoption, and the remainder of the items are for information. Note that item 9.2.3, the Cenotaph Municipal Historic Designation, is in relation to item 12.1, which is a bylaw to designate the Medicine Hat Cenotaph as a municipal historic resource.
I'll make that motion.
And I'll second.
Thank you. Any questions or debate? Councillor Sharps.
Thank you. Through the chair, I just wanted to say that I was so pleased to keep an eye on this particular report and to see the land acknowledgement and the TRC recommendations come through. I know that the committee's been working really hard. And in my very first day, I had said to, when we got sworn in, I had said to Mayor Clark, where's our land acknowledgement? And it's been something that's always bothered me. And I feel very strongly about this. So I am just over the moon to see that this was done. And I think the statement is fantastic. And if the chair could pass on the thanks of from council.
Councillor Hirsch.
Well, Your Worship, I just got a question with regard to, and I echo Councillor Sharp's comments on the committee's work. There was a multitude of recommendations listed, and I just want to ensure that we're not locking into acknowledging that all the recommendations that we're moving forward with, I guess I'd like to understand process. So there was a numerous amount of recommendations. We're looking at adoption on next steps, measurable milestones, considerations, and resources. But I'm wondering, what does that look like? Help me understand, because we don't necessarily, at this council, haven't determined whether or not we're gonna adopt all of them, or some of them, or many of them, et cetera. So can I just understand what that looks like?
Councillor Robbins, do you want to address that?
Sure, thank you. Through the chair. It's a discussion that we had with city staff at the meeting where we discussed the recommendations and understood that some of them may have a budget requirement, some of them have an advocacy requirement, some of them have requirements for employees to do certain things, and so we wanted city staff to be able to come back with recommendations to understand more fully what that means logistically as opposed to in the principle of the recommendations. So that's why it's worded for adoption in the way that it is we really need more information before we could decide how we would move forward with any recommendations that are made. Does that help you, Councillor Hirsch?
Well, it does. It just goes back to our previous item where we talked about what are we committing to, right? So I'm kind of doing this I guess, in this regard. I just want to understand that we're not committed to anything as of yet. I get it. You're going from a idealistic point of view into a little bit of, okay, we've got some ideas here. What does that look like from a pragmatic approach or practical approach? And can it be, some of these recommendations being brought in from a realistic point of view, if that's what you're telling me, that's how they're
I like to say the word logistic as opposed to realistic, because I think they're all realistic. It's
Okay.
whether the logistics are possible or not, and what that would mean for each department affected.
Yeah.
So there's
And
a lot of things to sort out.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I guess maybe the question is, can it be attainable? Right? So, fair enough. Thank you.
So for clarity, we are adopting the recommendation in the minutes of the Public Services Committee, not in the excerpt from the Community Vibrancy Advisory Board. Is that correct? Okay. I am up. I'm just wondering, and this is like, I guess, given the previous question may be irrelevant. I'm just wondering, there was one item in there that discussed protecting Indigenous artifacts, preserving and protecting Indigenous artifacts, which is obviously extremely important. But is that sort of overlapping with provincial jurisdiction under the, is it the Historical Artifacts Act, the Historic Resources Act, I think it is. Just wondering whether there was any assessment of that or what our role would be. But is that something better left to the recommendations coming from administration?
I think you're looking at me to answer that question. I don't know if you're looking at our city manager to answer the question, but that was, I believe, the intent of the committee, was that we would get further recommendations from city staff about any affected legislation as well.
Thank you, Councillor Robbins.
Oh, thank you. It's my turn to speak. I just wanted to say that the co-chairs of the Truth and Reconciliation Recommendations Committee are here, Ms. Smith and Ms. Surratt, and I thank them so much for coming and sitting through our meeting and the amount of work that they've done. And I should also thank our acting managing director, Presteko, over there, who's sort of hiding, who has also been involved in the process. And without all of their hard work, we wouldn't have come to the recommendations that you see before you today.
Councillor Van Dyke.
Thank you, and through the chair, and I feel bad that I have my back to you ladies, but I'm sorry that I had to miss the meeting on Monday because I wanted to say that I really appreciated all the difficult and thoughtful work that went into this. And I read the information that you had, the recommendations you had passed along, and then I looked back at the Alberta municipalities' recommendations as well, and it really brought to the forefront to me the idea that you looked at it as to how it best suited our community and our region, because it would have been easiest to just take recommendations that were laid out for municipalities and then just reworded them to suit, but you actually, as a group, went through them all and made a much more conscious decision about how they applied here and how they should be implemented here. So thank you very much to your entire group. Please pass along my thanks as well.
All right. I too would like to express our gratitude. As a council, this must have been a very difficult task to arrive at such a concise statement of recommendations that are consistent with our community and our needs and the needs of our Indigenous community, and some great recommendations in here. I'm looking forward to seeing what administration comes back with, because there's a lot to work with here. So thank you. Councillor Sharps.
Just to move on to another part of the report, does anybody have an update on the participation? Did we beat Lethbridge or not?
I don't think that's available yet. Seeing no further questions, we will vote. And that's unanimous. Thank you. Moving on to item 9.3, Council Employee Committee meeting dated June 28th, 2022. All items are for information.
So moved.
I'll second.
Thank you. Any questions or debate? Seeing none, we will vote. And that's unanimous. All right, we are now moving to item 10, reports for reception. First is item 10.1, Municipal Planning Commission, dated June 22nd, 2022.
So moved, Your Worship.
Second that.
Thank you. Any questions or debate or discussion? Councillor Hirsch.
Your Worship, on the minutes, it indicated the Mustard Seed had made application for development permit of change in use of 435 North Railway Street. I just wanted to inform council that that permit was withdrawn. So the matter was tabled for the next July 13th MPC meeting, but that is not going to be the case anymore. So just want to report that to council.
Any questions or comments? My understanding is that there have been some discussions with the applicant. Perhaps Acting Managing Director Presteco could provide us with an update on that.
Thank you, through the mayor. So yes, our understanding is indeed that the Mustard Seed has indicated their desire and has revoked their development permit application. If I can provide a little bit of background, perhaps, the Mustard Seed commenced operation of overnight shelter services in our community of April 1st this year. The service is funded through the contract with the Government of Alberta, which has the responsibility for funding and delivering shelter services in the province. The Mustard Seed is currently operating out of a building owned by the Salvation Army, which was the previous shelter provider, and the Salvation Army has listed that property for sale. With the withdrawal of the Mustard Seed development permit for the former Champion Centre building and the anticipated sale of the Salvation Army property, we are aware that this may leave the community without overnight shelter facility come this fall. We have also been advised that the provincial government will be putting out an RFP for shelter services and operations this fall. This could mean a change of providers come next April. We have had conversations with a number of the parties involved, including Mustard Seed and Community Housing Society, and have opened a channel of communications with the government itself. A couple of other things to note that while the province provides the funding to operate the shelter, the service provider is responsible to provide the space. The government has indicated that they have no desire or interest in owning properties and is currently looking to divest of some of the housing properties that it does own. And I'd also note that Medicine Hat is the only community of our size which does not have a 24/7 shelter in its community funded through the province. Recognizing that the city is neither the funder or the operator, we appreciate that council may have some desire for the city to support or enable community service providers to provide shelter services in Medicine Hat. This may include a role as a facilitator or a convener to explore solutions, engage in community consultation, and to promote partnerships with the city may or may not be involved in over the longer term. And any direction from council on that matter would be appreciated.
Thank you. We'll vote on the actual receipt of the report. And then if anyone wants to make a motion, for example, to refer exploration of options to administration, that would be entertained. So we'll vote on the reception of the Municipal Planning Commission report. And that's unanimous.
I'll make a motion, Mayor Clark, through the chair, for some further investigation by admin for a 24-hour shelter option in Medicine Hat.
I'll second.
All right, Any questions or comments? Okay, we'll vote on the motion. And that's unanimous. Moving on to item 10.2, Police Commission meeting of June 23rd, 2022.
I'll motion to accept.
Second.
Questions or comments? Councillor Van Dyke?
Yes, thank you. Through the chair, I just wanted to draw attention to the next meetings. I'm not sure, I'm not on the right page, sorry, but there will be no meeting in July, just for the public's awareness. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Robbins?
Thank you through the chair. I just wanted to say how much I appreciated this report because it really reflects the questions that the commission members were asking and the opportunity to sort of review some successes that had happened, but it seemed to bubble out of some questions that were asked, so it must be a very engaged group to be part of. So I just wanted to say, for what it's worth, I enjoyed reading it, and the passion for the people serving on the commission is really showing in these minutes.
Seeing no further questions, we'll vote on reception. And that's unanimous. Under unfinished business, we have item 11.1, Administrative Committee meeting, May 26, 2022, which was postponed at the June 6, 2022 City Council meeting. I would entertain a motion to refer this back to this item back to admin committee for to be brought back through to council.
So moved, Your Worship.
Second.
All right, we will vote. And that's unanimous. All right, the next item under 12 is new bylaws. 12.1 is bylaw number 4706, a bylaw of the City of Medicine Hat to designate the Medicine Hat Cenotaph as a municipal historic resource. And we can do all three readings, provided that unanimous consent is approved prior to the third reading.
I would move for leave to introduce bylaw number 4706, a bylaw of the City of Medicine Hat to designate the Medicine Hat Cenotaph as a historic resource, and that the bylaw be read for a first time.
I'll second.
All right, we will vote on first reading. And that's unanimous.
Sorry, I thought I turned that on. Thank you, Your Worship. I move that the bylaw number 4706, a bylaw of the City of Medicine Hat to designate the Medicine Hat Cenotaph as a historic resource, be read a second time.
I'll second that.
Any questions or debate? Councillor Hirsch.
Thanks, Your Worship. I don't sit on public services, and I just wanted to get some clarity. Obviously, this is in front of us right now, but can I get an understanding as to why it's in front of us? Like, I do understand what giving it the heritage protection that it requires. Is there concern? And I guess in the future, what does that mean? And I do understand that if it does get protected, that by itself, and maybe that can be explained a little bit, that we are talking about the Cenotaph and not necessarily the park in general. But just this, I guess, just the history on this as to why it's in front of us today. Thanks.
Councillor Robbins, would you want to speak to that, or I could refer it to a managing director as well?
I think Acting Managing Director Presteko probably has the history, and I don't mean to bypass our city manager at all, but it's been around for a little bit, and I know that she will have the information that you're looking for, Councillor Hirsch.
Acting Managing Director Pasteco.
Thank you for the question through the chair. The Cenotaph certainly is a well-known landmark in our community, and the request to have it designated came through our Heritage Resources Working Group, which you may remember through the readjustment of the advisory boards and committees had previously been the Heritage Resource Committee. So it is that group, and they were the group, particularly Sally Sen, who deserves huge commendation and kudos for putting together the statement of significance that you see before you today. So that group did ask us to bring forward, or they recommended and asked that we brought forward the desire to have that designated. That will see protection, give it to the Cenotaph in our community, and it is the Cenotaph in the area immediately surrounding the Cenotaph. It is not the park as a whole, as the question put forward. It will also provide some opportunity for us to apply for some other levels of funding through other governments in order to ensure that the Cenotaph is maintained and protected as well.
Seeing no further questions or debate, we will vote on second reading. And that's unanimous. So if anyone wanted to make a motion for unanimous consent to give it a third reading, that would be entertained.
I would make a motion that consent be given for a third reading at this meeting.
And I will second.
Thank you. We will vote on the motion. And that's unanimous.
I'm going to make one more motion and then I'm going to stop. I move that the bylaw be read a third time and passed.
And I second.
Questions or debate? Seeing none, we will vote on the third reading. And the bylaw is passed unanimously. All right, moving to item 14 under new business, we have item 14.1, which is a project Clear Horizon. And the recommendation is that City Council approves Project Clear Horizon Early Stage Evaluation and Development Initiative in the amount of $11 million to be funded through a combination of reallocated working capital and potential third-party funding.
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Thank you. Perhaps Managing Director Mains Managing Director Mains could give us a little bit of background on this project.
Absolutely, Your Worship. So Project Clear Horizon is a carbon capture, utilization, and storage project being proposed in southeast Alberta. The federal government has pledged legally binding net zero emission targets for Canada, and both the federal and provincial governments recognize CCUS as a viable technological solution to reduce carbon emissions for hard-to-abate, carbon-intensive industries. Project Clear Horizon is a made-in-Medicine Hat opportunity to provide a solution for carbon emissions to both existing and future industry, allowing for a balance between a strong economy and a healthy environment.
Thank you, Managing Director Mains. Are there any questions or comments? Councillor Robbins.
I just wonder if we could confirm that this is not new money. It's not a new budget request. Could you describe that perhaps a little bit?
Through the chair to Councillor Robbins, absolutely, this money is a reallocation of existing budgets that were formulated 4 years ago. It represents funds that were underspent or not spent relating to particular oil and gas assets which we no longer own, which we had anticipated 4 years ago to have owned through the entire budget period. So to Council, this is a reallocation of budgeted funds currently in it. This is not a new money request.
All right, seeing no further questions or comments, we'll vote on the motion. And that's unanimous. Moving to our second new business item is item 14.2, and that's an amendment to the indemnification policy. The recommendation there is through administrative committee that city council approves the resolution attached to the briefing note that I'm reading from, thereby amending the indemnification policy in order to grant the city manager the discretion to indemnify or otherwise conditionally commit to paying certain legal fees in any situation where a city manager determines it is appropriate to do so in accordance with the procedure of the policy. So it's an existing policy that's just receiving an amendment.
I'll make a motion.
Second.
Questions or debate? Seeing none, we'll vote on the motion. And that's unanimous. Seeing no further business, can I have a motion to go back into closed?
Motion.
I can second that.
Thank you. The open portion of this meeting is adjourned.